11 Creepiest Unsolved Mysteries No One Can Explain. Lots of you are too old and jaded to be kept awake at night by ghost stories and implausible urban legends. No, this time of year, you need the real shit. So, as a Halloween treat, we've collected a shitload of cases that ran cold because they were too weird, too convoluted, or too obviously haunted to be solved. 11. A mystery head was found in Pennsylvania, with rubber balls and ice sockets. On December 12, 2014, a little boy got off the school bus on a rural road in Economy, Pennsylvania and stumbled upon something kind of unusual, a severed goddamned head, lying in a field. The head belonged to an old woman, and because CSI is magic these days, investigators were able to determine that she was local to either Pennsylvania or its surrounding states. This is clearly not the bestial cranium of a Wisconsinite. But that's where it ended. She didn't match the profile of any missing person, and the rest of her body has never been found. So, was she a murder victim, maybe someone who lived off the grid? Well, here's the first twist: the head was professionally embalmed. That could mean that the head belonged to an already dead body that had been taken to a mortuary, except no mortuary, hospital, or graveyard in the area had any knowledge of a missing head. And how in the hell would they lose one? It's not like they're driving around with a pickup truck full of them. Likewise, investigators can't tell whether the embalming was done legally through the proper funerary process, or by some rogue, hobbyist in his or her basement, dungeon. The fact that nobody can identify the victim seems to imply the latter, right? Wait, it gets worse. Part of the difficulty in identifying the head can be attributed to the fact that her eyes had been removed. Both eyes had been replaced with fake ones, which is a common embalming procedure. However, in this case, the fake eyes were not the professional ones used by mortuaries, they were rubber children's toys, the kind of bouncy balls widely available from vending machines and dentists' prize chests all over the country. Investigators initially reasoned that the head had either fallen or been thrown from a moving vehicle. Again, are you picturing that? But if so, those rubber eyes would likely have popped out. No, somebody lovingly placed that severed head right there where it was found. If you've been keeping score, all of this adds up to the work of a complete fucking maniac. 10. A man commits a suspicious suicide after claiming to be a secret agent. In 1977, Charles C. Morgan owned an escrow company and lived a seemingly ordinary life with his family in Tucson. See, when you're telling a horror story, you have to start by emphasizing how ordinary the victims are, so the twist is more shocking. Then, he vanished without explanation on March 22, and stumbled back into his house in the middle of the night 3 days later. He claimed that he couldn't speak, but that he could write, and he wrote his wife a bizarre message claiming that someone had painted his throat with a hallucinogenic drug. Hey, you say, the guy probably went to Vegas and made up a bullshit cover story, right? He even insisted that his wife not contact the hospital or police, which is the kind of thing a person who just got back from a 3-day bender would say. After returning to health, Morgan refused to talk about the incident except to give clues that he'd been working secretly as an undercover agent for the Treasury Department. Sure, dude. Then, 2 months later, he disappeared again, only to be found dead from a gunshot wound outside his car in the Arizona desert. So, he went nuts and committed suicide, right? Well, that's how it was ruled. Despite the fact that he was shot in the back of the head, which, if you've ever tried it, is difficult to accomplish on your own. Also, he was wearing a bulletproof vest at the time, was found with a pair of sunglasses that did not belong to him, he had one of his own teeth in his pocket, and had a $2 bill stuffed in his underwear, which was annotated with 7 Spanish names and a Bible citation, Ecclesiastes 12:1-8. Oh, okay. Maybe, the guy was delusional and as part of his mental illness, intentionally staged his suicide to look like a murder? People do that, right? Wait, it gets worse. Before Morgan's body was discovered, his wife received an anonymous phone call from a woman identifying herself only as Green Eyes, who said nothing to her except Ecclesiastes 12:18, the same citation her husband was hiding in his underpants. Of course, if anyone was hoping to find the name of Morgan's killer in that Bible passage, they came away disappointed. The passage is just a bunch of depressing sentiments about how growing old is a serious bitch. It's basically a protracted version of late-career Johnny Cash. Later, Green Eyes contacted the police to let them know that she had been a friend of Morgan's, and that right before his death, he had shown her a briefcase filled with $60,000 in cash, which he'd hoped to use to buy off a hitman who was coming for him. We can reasonably assume this plan did not work. The informant gave enough personal details that the police were pretty confident she was telling the truth, at least as far as having known Morgan socially. Unfortunately, that was the last that anyone ever heard of Green Eyes, and the case went completely cold. Some people theorized that Morgan's escrow company was a front for money laundering, and the whole thing went south. Or, maybe he really was a secret agent for the government. Or, there's some third, even weirder explanation we couldn't have guessed in 1,000 years. If nobody's figured it out in the last 4 decades, we're guessing nobody is going to. 9. 2 teenage sisters are murdered, people continue to see them after their deaths. On the night of December 28, 1956, 15-year-old Barbara Grimes and 13-year-old Patricia Grimes went out to see the Elvis movie Love Me Tender, but never made it back home. 3 weeks later, their bodies were found dumped by the side of a road in the middle of nowhere. And with that, we've pretty much run out of information that experts actually agree on. Being that these were 2 teenage girls in the 1950s, when they went missing, everyone just assumed they'd run off to Nashville to look for Elvis. No, really, even Elvis himself released a statement pleading for the girls to come home. But the worst fears were realized when a construction worker found the corpses, frozen and completely naked, lying in a position that suggested they'd been thrown from a moving car. Barbara's chest was riddled with shallow stab wounds, none serious enough to cause death. It actually wasn't at all clear what had killed them. We still don't know. The case went cold until 2009, when a retired Chicago cop decided that it was probably worth a more thorough look. As it turns out, for 2 missing people, the girls sure were seen in a lot of places after they disappeared. Friends reported seeing the girls at the theater on the night they died, and multiple witnesses confirmed that they boarded the bus headed back home, only to get off halfway through the trip. 2 boys saw them a few minutes later, laughing and giggling with each other just 2 blocks from their house. A security guard claimed they asked him for directions on the morning of December 29th. One of their classmates spotted them from a restaurant window that evening, walking with 2 unknown girls. 2 separate employees reported that they checked into the nearby Claremont Hotel on December 30th. All of this represents an impressive effort on their part, considering the autopsy report placed their time of death within 5 hours of leaving their home for the movie on December 28th. They should have been too dead for any of the above shit to have happened. So, was the autopsy wrong? Were the witnesses around town just bullshitting the cops to get in on the act? You can go to jail for that, right? Wait, it gets worse. That brings us to the phone calls. On January 14th, a week before the bodies were discovered, the phone in the house of Patricia's classmate Sandra rang sometime around midnight. Sandra's mother answered, the caller hung up. The phone rang again a few minutes later, and this time a small, frightened voice asked for Sandra. The caller hung up before Sandra could get on the line. Sandra's mother swears that the voice on the other end was that of Patricia Grimes, even though medical science would later say she had been dead for more than 2 weeks by that point. Then, on the 15th, a point when most people still assumed the girls had run off to party in Nashville, the cops got a call from an anonymous person claiming he had a revelation in a dream that the girls were dead, and could be found in Santa Fe Park. The cops questioned the guy and decided he was neither a suspect nor a seer. 7 days later, The two corpses were found less than a mile from said park. That mysterious caller? None other than Elvis Presley. Okay, not really. It was just some local dude who, as far as they know, had nothing to do with it. Confused? Welcome to the club. 8. Jonathan Luna commits the strangest suicide on record. Back in 2003, 38-year-old Jonathan Luna, a married father of two, was working as an assistant United States attorney in Baltimore, Maryland. On the night of December 3, he stayed late at the office, which was normal for him, and got into his car at 11:38 p.m. to drive back to his house, also in Baltimore. The next morning, his body was found stabbed an absurd number of times, and dumped in a stream in Pennsylvania, which you may recognize as being an entirely different state than Maryland. Even stranger than suddenly getting murdered was Luna's behavior after leaving the office the night of his death. For one thing, rather than heading home, he drove to Delaware, where he withdrew $200 from an ATM. Then, for reasons that can never be explained, he drove to freaking Pennsylvania. Along the way, he crossed a toll road. His ticket had blood on it, suggesting that he'd already been attacked but was still determined to complete whatever mission he was on. Luna's body was discovered in a Pennsylvania stream, and although he'd been stabbed 36 times and his throat was cut, his ultimate cause of death was drowning. Wait, it gets worse. None of the cash that Luna withdrew from the Delaware ATM was stolen. In fact, it was scattered around his car, as though whoever killed him rooted through his vehicle looking for something else. His blood was all over the back seat, suggesting that most if not all of the stabbing occurred there, and the car's engine was still running when his body was discovered. Also, Luna had apparently been in a huge hurry to jump state lines, because he left his office in such a rush that he forgot his glasses, which he presumably needed for, driving, on his desk. Some, including the local coroner's office, actually wanted the death reclassified as a suicide, literally saying the guy used a Swiss Army knife to jab himself over and over. Other police aren't quite so sure, considering no one in history has ever committed suicide by stabbing themselves 36 times, slashing their own throat, and jumping into a stream. Luna's case is still open, although it has remained cold since 2003. If you happen to know what went down, the FBI will give you $100,000 for the info. 7. A young man is murdered. An anonymous person pays for his burial and sends notes. In January 1935, a young man checked into room 1046 of the Hotel President in Kansas City, Missouri under the name Roland T. Owen. 2 days later, Owen was found naked inside his blood-soaked room. Before he passed out, he claimed that his injury was due to having fallen against the bathtub. It must have been one hell of a fall, because he'd also been tied up, beaten, strangled, and stabbed. On the way to the hospital, he succumbed to his injuries. Authorities immediately began to suspect that Owen hadn't simply fallen over. In addition to his wounds, every single item that had belonged to him had been stolen from the room, including the clothing from his body. And on numerous occasions, Owen had been heard speaking or arguing with an unidentified man who he kept referring to as Don. Not too surprisingly, Roland T. Owen turned out to be a fake name, which meant that the police actually wound up with less information than they had in the beginning, which is not the way that investigations are supposed to work. The mystery of room number 1046 inches turned out to be a real head-scratcher. Given that nobody could figure out who the victim was, plans were made to bury him cheaply in an anonymous grave. But shortly after this plan was announced by the press, the authorities received an anonymous phone call from someone offering to pay for a proper funeral in a regular cemetery. As promised, money soon arrived in the mail, along with the bouquet of roses and a card signed "Love Forever, Louise." Wait, what? Who the hell is Louise? Who was anyone involved in this thing? The cops staked out the funeral in case the anonymous benefactor made an appearance, but of course, nobody ever did. It wasn't until a year and a half later that a woman from Birmingham, Alabama, saw a photo of Ogun in the paper and immediately identified him as her long-lost brother, Artemis Ogletree, which you may recognize as a name that could only exist in the 1930s. Mystery solved, right? Wait, it gets worse. Ogletree's family had not seen him since he left home, a year before he died. However, they later received 3 typewritten letters from him, dated after his death. Now, his family hadn't learned of his demise yet, but they found the letters suspicious all the same, because Artemis didn't know how to type. Finally, Mrs. Ogletree got a phone call from a man calling himself Jordan who told her that Artemis had gotten married to a wealthy woman in Egypt. And that was the last she heard about her son, until she discovered he'd been long dead in a hotel room in Kansas City. So what kind of twisted soap opera did Artemis Ogletree get himself involved in? What could have possibly paved the way for all this bizarre drama? Why would someone murder Ogletree in such a brutal fashion and then pay for his funeral? Is that some sort of tax write-off? If anyone knows, they've been keeping it to themselves for the last 80 years. And if you want to go even further back. 6. An inventor disappears, turns up again under a different identity, only that's not what happened at all. This is to be one of history's weirder stories. Back in the 1880s, William Cantillo perfected his design for a new and improved machine gun in the cellar beneath his pub in Southampton, England. Then he packed up his shiny new invention with the help of his 2 sons, and set out to make a glorious fortune from the time-honored tradition of war profiteering. He never returned. Cantillo's sons tirelessly searched for their missing inventor father, basically reenacting a years-long version of the first act of Disney's Beauty and the Beast. A private detective found evidence that Cantillo had gone to America, and that a whole bunch of money had suddenly disappeared from his bank account, but never found any other clues as to what the hell had befallen him. It appeared, however, that the mystery was solved soon after. An inventor who was identical in every way named Hiram Maxim had hit the scene in America selling his Maxim gun, basically a mounted machine gun that was more efficient than previous versions, but came at the cost of looking like history's deadliest penny farthing. Also, the gun happened to be the exact same design as William Cantillo's. It was obvious what happened. Cantillo had decided he didn't want to share his upcoming riches with his boring old family, so just rebranded himself under the clearly fake name Maxim, figuring he'd soon be drowning in both cash and American poon. The scam was blown when Cantillo's son spotted Hiram Maxim's picture in a local newspaper, and noticed that he looked like he could be their missing father's elderly stunt double. The man had come back to England, and the sons confronted their estranged father at a train station, in what was sure to be one of the more awkward reunions in history. Wait, it gets worse, it wasn't their father. Maxim could prove that he had been born and raised in the United States via census records and church registrars. He just so happened to look like Cantillo, to the point that the man's own freaking children thought it was him. Just so happened to have invented the exact same thing at about the exact same time, and just so happened to have started selling his gun at the same moment the inventor of the rival device disappeared into thin air. You may notice this as being suspicious as fuck. Oh, and it should be noted that Maxim had been to Southampton before, to meet with a different inventor, who accused him of stealing ideas. So did Maxim buy Cantillo's invention, then stomp him out like a campfire to patent the gun as his own, stealing a handsome sum from Cantillo's bank account in the process? Or was it just a case of parallel thinking and impossible coincidence? Oh, and let's just add another layer to the weirdness. Maxim complained in his autobiography that he had a double going around the USA pretending to be him. The exact thing Cantillo's kids accused him of doing. What hell? Of course, everyone involved in this mystery is intensely dead, so we'll never know for certain what exactly the hell is, unless someone invents a time machine. 5. Blair Adams runs across 2 countries before getting murdered the most bizarre way imaginable. Everything about this case reads like this guy was targeted by the monster from It Follows. Blair Adams was an average 31-year-old Canadian construction worker who, on July 5, 1996, suddenly withdrew all the money in his bank account, emptied his safe deposit box, grabbed everything of any value from his home that he could fit in his pockets, and made a beeline for the U.S. border. Unfortunately for Adams, it turns out that U.S. Border Patrol tends to be suspicious of young men trying to enter America alone with giant suitcases full of money, even from the Canadian side, so he was turned away. The next day, Adams quit his job and bought a plane ticket to Germany, immediately changed his mind and got a refund on the ticket, then showed up at a friend's house insisting that someone wanted to kill him. He begged his friend to smuggle him into America. When she refused, Adams got a rental car and tried again to cross the border. This time, he got through, and once he was in Seattle, he bought a plane ticket to Washington, D.C., then drove to Knoxville, TN. This is less a sightseeing route and more like the path of a man who is desperately trying to lose something that he thinks is chasing him. Maybe he was paranoid. That's all we've really got so far, right? Wait, it gets worse. Once in Tennessee, witnesses reported that Adams entered a gas station and complained that his car wouldn't start. The attendant investigated and found that Adams had the wrong keys, even though he'd obviously managed to drive that car to the gas station somehow. He then hitchhiked to a hotel, paid for a room, but never went to it. After handing over the money, he immediately left the hotel and never came back. Hours later, his dead body was found in a parking lot half a mile from the hotel. His pants had been removed forcibly, it looked like, and the cause of death was found to be a single apocalyptic punch to the stomach, so powerful that it ruptured his internal fucking organs. And that's it. That's all anyone knows. To this day, nobody can explain who Blair Adams thought was after him, or who challenged this Canadian man to a final, pantsless stomach-punching contest in goddamn Knoxville. 4. A retired police officer uncovers a 30-year-old recording from his son's probable killer. Warning, this one involves a dead child, and is one of the worst things we've ever heard. On January 12, 1984, 7-year-old Gary Grant Jr., the son of a New Jersey police detective, left his Atlantic City home and told his mother he had an appointment with someone. Given that 7-year-olds aren't exactly known for their business acumen, his mother thought that was strange, but figured the kid was being silly and let him out to play with his friends. He never came back, and 2 days later he was found bludgeoned to death with a metal pipe. The investigation soon turned to Gary's 12-year-old friend Carl Boo Mason, who was reportedly the last person to have seen Gary alive. After an interrogation, Boo admitted to having killed Gary, and he was arrested for the crime. So far, this is all incredibly depressing, but hardly mysterious. You've seen stuff like this on the news before. Even kids can kill. The only problem was that Boo was mentally challenged, enough that he would have admitted to killing JFK if that was the question they'd asked him. The admission was ruled inadmissible, Boo was released, and the cops were left without a lead. Until 2 years later, when someone wrote an seeming confession on the side of a patrol car. It read, "Gary Grant's dead. I am living. Another will die on January 12th if all goes right." Thankfully, it looks like all did not go right, because nobody was killed on January 12th, as far as anyone is aware. Instead, another message was written on a sidewalk, saying, "Gary Grant Jr. lives. I still killed him. Son of a pig officer." Payback is AMF. They never tracked down whoever was leaving the messages, and the case went cold for 30 years. So was the graffiti a clue, or a hoax from some shithead trying to taunt the father of the victim? In either case, whoever left it almost certainly deserves to get whipped in the crotch with a length of rusty log chain. Wait, it gets worse. Nearly 3 decades later, in December 2015, the now-retired Gary Grant Sr. was going through a bunch of old evidence when he came across an audio recording from 1986. It was an anonymous caller admitting fucking responsibility for Gary's murder to a police dispatcher, which for some reason was never pursued as a lead. Warning, this is disturbing as hell. The psychopath glibly asks if he can still collect a reward for information on Gary's murder if he did the murder himself. He ends by insisting it's not a prank call, and boasting that he'll never be caught. The guy isn't disguising his voice or anything. If investigators had had that audio, who knows? Maybe it sounds like somebody they'd already interviewed. Of course, it could have been a prankster. This call took place on March 8, which would have been Gary's 10th birthday, and it occurred around the same time those cryptic messages appeared on the police car and the sidewalk. Unfortunately, due to the police's cunning investigative technique of stash and incriminating recording in a box for 3 decades, we'll probably never know. 3. A woman disappears from a Disney cruise ship, and there are hints of a bizarre cover-up. Britisher Rebecca Corriam worked as a youth activities coordinator aboard the Disney cruise ship Wonder, which sounds like the happiest job in the world, unless you know absolutely anything about Disney or cruise ships. Corriam was seen on a security video having a distressing phone conversation on the morning of March 22, 2011 before leaving her quarters. And that's the last time anyone ever saw her. She didn't show up for work that day, and couldn't be located after a ship-wide search. That means she went overboard, though a Coast Guard search of the surrounding waters didn't find a body. Now, to understand why it's a pain in the ass to find the truth about anything that happens on a cruise ship, you have to understand the weird legal gray area in which these vessels float. The investigation into Corriam's disappearance was assigned to a single police officer in Nassau, Bahamas, because that's where the ship is registered for transparently nefarious purposes, which include avoiding certain taxes and safety regulations. It's hard to be the happiest place on earth if you have to follow the fucking rules. In other words, this cop had jurisdiction purely due to the boat having put that address on some forms to exploit tax loopholes. Sure enough, the officer spent exactly 1 day on the ship before hauling ass back to the Bahamas, and never following up on the disappearance ever again. It's not like his department had reason to prioritize a case involving some British lady on the good ship Mickey Mouse. The official story was that Corriam was near the railing when a rogue wave hit the ship, sending her toppling overboard. Note, there is no evidence or testimony that a rogue wave hit the boat that day. It sounds a lot like a boilerplate explanation for a cruise ship that you don't want to bother with. Wait, it gets worse. It really appears someone is trying to cover up what happened. In November of 2011, journalist John Ronson boarded the Wonder to get to the bottom of this, and immediately found everyone acting suspicious as all hell. Some Disney crew members swore Corriam's disappearance never happened at all, because that's the answer they have to give. Other crew members recited the story of a visibly upset Rebecca going to a private crew-only pool on their deck, surrounded by a high steel wall, and intentionally climbing overboard. Disney even says they found one of her sandals by the pool, which seemed to confirm this theory. Except for the fact that one of Corriam's close friends insists that she never wore a pair of sandals like that in her entire time on the ship. If so, why in the hell would the cruise line lie about that? Another of her friends insists that the Disney higher-ups placed a bouquet of flowers by the crew pool after her disappearance without any explanation, which suggests that they either knew she fell overboard at that spot or wanted people to believe she did. And here's the thing, the vast majority of the crew seem to be in agreement that somewhere, someone within Disney knows exactly what happened, simply because virtually every square inch of the ship is monitored by security cameras, including the spot of Corriam's alleged suicide. Members of the British Parliament have pushed for answers, suggesting that the truth is something Disney doesn't want out there, such as that Corriam was sexually assaulted, she was last seen wearing oversized clothes that weren't her own, and then murdered. But Disney insists there is no video, and in fact won't even disclose locations of their security cameras. No one has jurisdiction to force them to, Because again, cruise ship. Obviously, nobody is saying Disney is going around having people killed. Saying shit like that is the kind of thing that will get you killed by Disney. But if the young woman was the victim of something that would put Disney cruises in the headlines for all the wrong reasons, well, maybe they're happy to leave it a mystery. Oh, and if you happen to know something, you can say so here. 2. A man dies of an alleged overdose, and his parents receive a creepy anonymous letter. In 2011, a Chilliwack, British Columbia man named Corey Scrooby was found dead in his home. He was discovered on his knees in front of a sofa, his face pressed down into the cushion. There was a pool of black fluid surrounding him which looked like dried blood. In the absence of foul play, police ruled that Scrooby's likely cause of death was acute combined cocaine and ethanol intoxication. In short, they figured he had simply balled too hard. They said there were no signs of trauma. The pool of blood was, they said, the natural result of the body purging its fluids after death. Scrooby's parents found this unlikely, stating that Scrooby didn't do drugs, to the extent that he never so much as took an aspirin. Of course, that's what everyone's parents say, but Scrooby's parents also claimed they found bloody footprints, which appeared to be a woman's, throughout the house, and a bloody handprint was found on his wallet, from which all the cash was missing. Also, a mysterious woman was supposedly seen at the apartment a few days earlier, who has not been identified to this day. Oh, and there was a cardboard box in the front hall scrawled with the words "Better be a funeral." The police say all of that can be explained. They say the bloody footprints weren't there when they arrived, and were probably the result of somebody being sloppy at the crime scene. And it's easy to imagine that these are simply parents in denial. There were no further leads indicating any crime, and the case remained cold for the next 3 years. Wait, it gets worse. In 2014, Scrooby's parents received an anonymous letter, which appears to have been written on the kind of old-timey typewriter that hasn't been used by anyone since the last World War. It read, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Scrooby, Shakespeare said, 'Hell hath no fury than a woman scorned.'" That's the kind of homicide it was, a scorned woman. Those who know it was, belong to too tight a group to say a word. I think your son Corey decided too late to back off, and it jeopardized his well-being, his life. Sincerely, a reader of the CHWK Times. Part of that sounds like a crank who heard about the case in the papers, and part of it sounds like they have inside info. It would have been easy to dismiss it as the former. But then a friend of Scrooby's named Tammy Burdon contacted his parents, claiming that she knew that Scrooby had been murdered over a drug deal, but she couldn't say who did it, or else she would be next. Well, maybe she was also a crank, or maybe even the same one who wrote the letter. We could ask her, but a few months later, she cut her finger and died of blood poisoning. Alright. To this day, Scrooby's death is still officially an overdose. And hey, maybe it was. Maybe these other tipsters didn't know anything, but couldn't resist stirring the pot for the spiteful hell of it. Though, if true, that's pretty horrifying on its own. 1. A college freshman vanishes from his room and is never seen again. On the night of December 10, 1999, Michael Negrete attended a party in his UCLA dorm, then went and played computer games with a friend until 4 a.m., at which point he went out into the hall to high-five his opponent. This was back in the golden days of LAN parties, before calmly re-entering his room, and apparently disappearing forever into a fold in the universe. By all accounts, Negrete was a well-adjusted kid with no history of depression or drug use. He had good grades and was attending UCLA on a music scholarship. Also, all of his belongings, including his wallet, shoes, and keys, were still in his room, completely undisturbed. After Negrete's roommate reported his disappearance the next morning, a bloodhound traced Negrete sent to a bus stop a few miles away, where the trail went suddenly cold. However, investigators were unable to answer why Negrete would have suddenly decided to catch a bus at 4 in the morning without saying a word to anyone, or why the driver would have let him board without the aforementioned wallet and shoes. Wait, it gets worse. The only other lead came in the form of an unidentified man in his mid-30s who was spotted in Negri's dorm that night, wearing a shiny gray jacket with a turquoise-colored design. Now, a man in his 30s creeping around a college dorm at 4 a.m. while dressed like a rollerblader is absolutely suspicious, but police were never able to track him down. And that's it. It's been 17 years of absolutely nothing. If Negri spontaneously ran away to start a new life, he did it without money. He never tried to access his bank accounts or contact any family or friends. If he sleepwalked into a fatal accident on the UCLA campus, or spontaneously decided to commit suicide, surely a body would have turned up. He couldn't have gotten far with no transportation and no shoes. That would seem to leave murder as the only remaining possibility. But if Negri had enemies or a secret life, absolutely no one had ever seen even the slightest hint of it. If he was abducted from the dorm by force, no one heard or saw anything, and no evidence of a struggle or a break-in was left behind. Sure, it was in the wee hours of the morning, but this was a dorm full of college students. Somebody would have seen or heard something. The kid played some games, said goodnight to his friend, headed to his dorm, then disappeared into thin air. Zero witnesses, then or after. No corpse, no credible tips, no physical evidence tossed down the trash chute, nobody saying they picked up a hitchhiker in his pajamas. Nothing. And it's not like he went missing in 19th century London, when records were sloppy, nobody owned cameras, and common folk could disappear by moving 2 blocks away. This guy vanished the same year Will Smith won a Grammy for getting jiggy with it. The only lesson here is that, even today, any one of us can spontaneously disappear.